Utah suburb, a man was reported missing under circumstances that did not initially raise alarm. There was no sign of a struggle, no urgent call for help, and no immediate reason to believe a crime had taken place. The explanation given for his absence appeared plausible, even routine. For days, the situation was treated as anything but a homicide. Daily life continued. Messages were sent in his name, and the assumption that he had simply left went largely unchallenged. It was only when investigators began separating verifiable facts from what they were being told that the case shifted, revealing that the death they were looking for had already occurred, long before anyone realized it. Jennifer Gledhill lived with her husband in Utah, where their life appeared stable, private, and largely unremarkable to those around them. They resided in a suburban environment, maintained regular routines, and interacted with family and acquaintances without drawing attention. There were no public incidents, no police involvement, and no visible disruptions that suggested instability within the household. From the outside, the marriage appeared conventional. The couple shared a home, divided responsibilities, and presented themselves as functioning adults managing everyday obligations. Neighbors later described them as reserved but normal. Friends recalled routine interactions that did not raise concern. There was no outward indication that the relationship was volatile or in crisis. Daily life followed predictable patterns. Work schedules were maintained, errands were completed, and communication with others remained consistent. The household did not exhibit the type of disorder that often precedes immediate intervention. This apparent normalcy would later shape how events were initially interpreted by those outside the marriage. The couple did not project intimacy or conflict in excess. They appeared neither unusually close nor openly distant. Their interactions with others suggested a relationship that functioned within socially accepted boundaries. This balance contributed to the assumption that the marriage was stable and self-contained. However, the structure of the relationship was defined less by mutual transparency than by controlled presentation. Within the marriage, information did not flow evenly. Statements later collected by investigators indicated that Jennifer Gledhill often managed communication with the outside world. When explanations were required, she provided them. When questions arose, she answered them. This centralization of communication did not appear unusual at the time, as many households operate with one partner handling external matters. This pattern extended to how the marriage was described to others. Details about daily life, plans, and issues were selectively shared. Conversations about the household were framed carefully and consistently. Discrepancies, when they existed, were subtle enough to avoid notice. The marriage functioned within a closed, informational environment. Financial matters, personal disagreements, and internal conflicts were not openly discussed. This privacy reinforced the perception that the relationship was orderly and under control. Investigators would later note that such containment limited external awareness. Without visible conflict or disclosure, those outside the marriage had little basis for questioning what they observed. The absence of complaints or interventions contributed to a sense of stability. Control within the relationship did not manifest through overt dominance or public confrontation. Instead, it appeared through routine mechanisms, managing schedules, directing conversations, and shaping narratives presented to others. These behaviors, taken individually, were not remarkable. Together, they established a pattern. Jennifer Gledhill was often the primary point of contact in social contexts. Friends later recalled that she frequently spoke on behalf of the household. When logistical matters were discussed, she responded. When explanations were needed, she supplied them. This role was not initially perceived as unusual or concerning. The marriage's outward presentation remained consistent over time. There were no abrupt changes in behavior, no visible escalation of conflict, and no external indicators that would suggest impending violence. This consistency would later complicate early interpretations of the case. Inside the household, however, authority was exercised quietly. Decisions regarding communication, timing, and disclosure were managed in a controlled manner. This did not draw attention precisely because it did not disrupt routine. The relationship appeared functional because it avoided visible instability. Investigators reviewing the case would later emphasize that the absence of overt conflict does not equate to equality or transparency within a relationship. In this case, the lack of visible disruption concealed underlying dynamics that would only become apparent after the fact. The marriage was structured in a way that limited external scrutiny. Friends and family were not privy to internal disagreements or power imbalances. Without access to those details, there was no framework for interpreting later events as criminal rather than incidental. This dynamic became especially relevant after the death occurred. The established pattern of controlled communication allowed initial explanations to appear plausible. Statements made to others aligned with the outward image of the marriage, reinforcing assumptions that no crime had taken place. The household's internal structure also influenced how timelines were presented. Accounts of daily routines were delivered with confidence and consistency. Without immediate contradictions, these accounts were accepted at face value. Only later, when investigators began comparing statements with verifiable records, did the limitations of this controlled narrative become evident. At the time, however, there was no reason for those outside the marriage to question what they were being told. The relationship's apparent stability delayed suspicion. There was no history of public conflict to contextualize the death as a result of domestic escalation. Instead, the marriage's outward normalcy shaped early assumptions and responses. In retrospect, investigators would identify patterns that had existed long before the crime. These patterns did not point directly to violence, but they did indicate an imbalance in how information was controlled and presented. The significance of these patterns was only understood after the case progressed. Chapter 1 of this case is defined not by a specific incident, but by context. A marriage that appeared ordinary, a household that maintained privacy without drawing attention, a structure in which control was exercised quietly and consistently. This context explains why the death was not immediately recognized as a homicide. The relationship's outward stability provided a framework in which alternative explanations seemed reasonable. It would take evidence, verification, and time to dismantle that framework. At this stage, nothing about the marriage suggested an imminent crime. There were no warnings, no public signals, and no external interventions. The relationship appeared contained, controlled, and unremarkable. That appearance would prove decisive in the days that followed. The events of the night in question unfolded inside the shared home. What is known about that night is based on a combination of documented evidence, verified timelines, and statements later evaluated during the investigation. There were no eyewitnesses to the crime itself, and no emergency call was placed at the time the fatal act occurred. The evening began without any documented irregularities visible to those outside the household. There were no reports of disturbance from neighbors, no recorded calls to emergency services, and no indications that outside parties were involved. The environment remained contained within the private setting of the residence. At some point during the night, a fatal act took place inside the home. Investigators later established that the death did not occur as a result of an accident or natural causes. The exact moment of death could not be pinpointed to a specific minute, but evidence placed it within a limited and defined time window during the night. What is significant is not only the act itself, but what followed. After the death occurred, no immediate attempt was made to seek medical assistance. There was no call for help, and no effort to alert authorities. This absence of response became a critical factor in how the investigation later evaluated the events of that night. Instead, subsequent actions focused on managing the situation internally. Evidence later collected showed that the scene was not treated as a medical emergency. The lack of emergency response meant that the death was not documented at the time it occurred. This delay allowed for actions to be taken without immediate oversight. Investigators later reconstructed the sequence of events using physical evidence recovered from the residence, digital data, and records of activity following the incident. These elements provided insight into what occurred after the fatal act, even in the absence of witnesses. The body was not reported missing that night. There were no attempts to contact family members or authorities to explain an unexpected death. The absence of such communication was not immediately noticed because the situation was presented differently in the days that followed. Physical evidence inside the residence indicated that the death occurred indoors and was not the result of an external intrusion. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence suggesting a third party had entered the home during the relevant time frame. The environment inside the residence remained largely intact. This contributed to the initial difficulty in recognizing the event as a homicide. There was no immediate scene that resembled a violent crime in the way such incidents are often imagined. Investigators later determined that steps were taken after the death to prevent immediate detection. These steps did not involve alerting emergency services or seeking assistance. Instead, the focus appeared to be on controlling the narrative of what had occurred. What is known with certainty is that the death was not accidental, and it was not reported when it happened. The handling of the body became a central component of the investigation. Evidence showed that the body was moved after death. This movement did not occur as part of any legitimate emergency response or medical intervention. The act of moving the body was deliberate and occurred within a limited time frame following the fatal act. Investigators reconstructed this portion of the timeline using forensic evidence and corroborating records. The movement of the body was not random. It followed a sequence that suggested an effort to remove the deceased from the immediate setting of the home. There were no witnesses to this movement. No one reported seeing activity consistent with an emergency during the night. The lack of observation further supported the conclusion that the actions were taken deliberately and without external involvement. Digital evidence later became crucial in narrowing the timeline. Phone activity, message logs, and device usage helped establish periods of activity and inactivity during the night. These records did not indicate any attempt to seek help at the time the death occurred. Instead, communication patterns suggested an effort to maintain the appearance of normalcy. Messages were later sent that implied the deceased was still alive after the time investigators determined death had occurred. These communications were not spontaneous. They were sent during a period when the deceased could no longer have authored them. This discrepancy became a key indicator that the death had already occurred by the time these messages were sent. Investigators did not rely on any single piece of evidence to reconstruct the night. Instead, they evaluated multiple sources. physical findings, digital records, and verified timelines. Together, these elements formed a coherent picture of events. The death occurred inside the home during the night. It was not reported. The body was moved. Communications were sent to create the appearance that the deceased was still alive. These facts are supported by evidence and were later confirmed during legal proceedings. What remains equally important is what did not occur. There was no attempt to involve emergency services. There was no immediate disclosure to family or authorities. There was no indication that the death was treated as an unexpected tragedy at the time it happened. The night did not end with a call for help. It ended with a situation that would only later be recognized as a homicide. By the following day, the death was already being framed as something else. The foundation for that framing was laid during the hours immediately after the fatal act occurred. Investigators later emphasized that the absence of immediate reporting was not incidental. It shaped how the case unfolded and delayed recognition of the crime. The time between the death and its discovery allowed for actions that complicated the investigative process. The reconstruction of the night relied heavily on what could be proven rather than what was claimed. Statements made later were evaluated against physical evidence and digital records. Where those elements conflicted, investigators relied on what could be independently verified. This approach allowed them to establish a timeline that did not depend on uncorroborated explanations. The night of the crime was not chaotic or uncontrolled. Based on available evidence, it unfolded in a contained and deliberate manner. The absence of external witnesses and the controlled environment inside the residence limited immediate detection. By the time authorities became involved, the critical events of that night had already passed. What remained was evidence, records, and a narrative that would later be tested against both. The significance of the night lies not only in the fatal act itself, but in the choices made afterward. Those choices transformed a death that might have been immediately recognized into one that remained concealed for a critical period. This chapter establishes what is known. The death occurred inside the home during the night. It was not reported when it happened, and actions were taken to prevent immediate discovery. These facts are supported by evidence and would later become central to the case. The following chapter examines what was said after that night and how those statements began to unravel. When investigators first became involved, the situation was not treated as a homicide. The death that had occurred during the night was not immediately recognized as such, and the information available to law enforcement was shaped almost entirely by the explanations provided afterward. Initial contact with investigators centered on an absence rather than a crime. Statements given described a situation in which the deceased was no longer present, without immediate indication that a fatal event had already taken place. These early explanations framed the situation as unresolved rather than violent. Jennifer Gledhill was the primary source of information during these initial stages. Her statements established the first narrative investigators were asked to work from. At the time, there was no independent evidence contradicting her account, and the information provided appeared sufficient to explain the circumstances as they were then understood. Her earliest statements focused on routine. She described recent interactions as normal and didn't indicate that anything unusual had occurred during the night. There was no mention of conflict, emergency, or sudden event. According to these accounts, the situation was presented as an unexplained absence rather than the aftermath of a crime. Investigators documented these statements carefully. They recorded timelines, descriptions of recent activities, and explanations for why the deceased was no longer present. At this stage, the information did not immediately raise red flags. The narrative aligned with the outward normalcy that had characterized the household. As part of standard procedure, investigators asked follow-up questions. These questions were designed to clarify timelines and establish a sequence of events leading up to the disappearance. Jennifer Gledhill provided answers that appeared coherent and internally consistent during initial interviews. The explanations given relied heavily on assumptions rather than verifiable events. Activities were described in general terms, and precise times were not emphasized. This lack of specificity was not unusual in early interviews, particularly when no crime was suspected. Over time, however, additional statements were required. As investigators attempted to verify details, they returned with more targeted questions. They asked about the last confirmed contact, the final known location, and any communication that had occurred after the disappearance. Each response added detail to the narrative. It was during this process that inconsistencies began to emerge. The first discrepancies were subtle. Times shifted slightly between statements. Sequences of events were reordered. Details that had been omitted earlier were introduced later. None of these deviations on their own conclusively indicated deception. Investigators documented them but did not immediately challenge them. As interviews continued, the narrative required adjustment to account for newly identified facts. When investigators referenced phone records or digital activity, explanations were offered that differed from earlier accounts. Each explanation addressed the immediate question but altered the overall timeline. For example, statements regarding communication after the disappearance evolved over time. Initial explanations suggested routine contact. Later accounts modified who initiated contact and when. These changes were documented and compared against verifiable records. Investigators noted that the explanations were responsive rather than proactive. Details were provided when prompted rather than volunteered. This pattern did not, by itself, constitute evidence of wrongdoing, but it affected how statements were evaluated. As more information became available, investigators began comparing statements given at different times. This comparison revealed that certain explanations couldn't coexist without contradiction. Timelines that had once appeared flexible became constrained by verified data. Digital evidence played a significant role in this phase. Phone records, message timestamps, and device activity provided fixed points that could not be altered. When statements conflicted with these records, investigators documented the discrepancies. In response, explanations shifted again. Some details were revised, others were reframed. Investigators recorded each version, noting where and how the narrative changed. Importantly, these deviations were not acknowledged as corrections. Instead, each new statement was presented as an extension of the previous one. There was no explicit admission that earlier explanations had been inaccurate. Investigators began to view the statements collectively rather than individually. While any single discrepancy could be attributed to confusion or stress, the accumulation of inconsistencies required closer scrutiny. At this stage, investigators did not accuse or confront. Their role was to gather information and assess credibility. Interviews remained structured and methodical. Statements were recorded verbatim and preserved for later analysis. As questioning continued, the explanations for the disappearance became increasingly complex. Additional details were introduced to address gaps identified by investigators. This complexity made the narrative more difficult to reconcile with documented facts. One of the key issues involved the timing of events. Early statements placed certain actions before others. Later statements reversed that order. These changes affected how investigators understood the sequence of the night and the following day. Investigators also noted discrepancies in descriptions of behavior. Actions described as routine in one statement were later characterized differently. The context surrounding certain decisions shifted depending on the question being asked. Throughout this process, investigators maintained a clear distinction between what was said and what could be verified. Statements were not accepted at face value once contradictions emerged. Instead, they were evaluated against independent evidence. As the narrative continued to change, investigators began to recognize a pattern. The explanations appeared to adapt in response to new information rather than remaining stable. This adaptability suggested that the narrative was being managed rather than recalled. This realization marked a turning point in how statements were interpreted. Investigators began treating them as data points to be tested rather than as a reliable account of events. By this stage, the gap between the explanations provided and the verifiable facts had become too significant to ignore. Statements no longer served to clarify the situation. Instead, they raised additional questions. The disappearance could no longer be explained solely through the accounts given. Investigators recognized that the truth of what had occurred would not be found through further explanation alone. This chapter of the investigation established a critical foundation. It documented how the initial narrative was constructed, how it evolved, and how it ultimately failed to align with evidence. The following phase of the investigation would no longer focus on what was being said, but on what could be proven. As investigators continued to document inconsistencies in the accounts surrounding Matthew Johnson's disappearance, the case shifted from interviews and narrative comparisons to evidence that could be measured. The questions were no longer limited to what was being said. They became focused on what could be proven through digital data, physical findings, and forensic reconstruction. One of the earliest and most consequential steps was securing digital records. Investigators sought phone data, message histories, and location information to establish a timeline independent of personal explanations. Digital evidence has a fixed quality that interviews do not. Messages carry timestamps. Devices register movement. Even deleted content can leave traces in logs, backups, or associated metadata. Over time, those records begin to define the boundaries of what can be true. In this case, law enforcement identified communications that became difficult to reconcile with the missing person narrative. According to court filings and reporting based on investigative records, authorities focused on messages connected to an alleged affair partner. Communications that included discussions of the husband in a way investigators interpreted as inconsistent with the claim that he was merely missing. Digital evidence was paired with another category that carried particular weight: recorded audio. Investigators obtained a recorded phone call described in court proceedings and media reporting, in which the accused is alleged to have discussed the situation in terms that suggested knowledge of a death before the official missing person report. In such cases, the evidentiary value is not a matter of tone or impression. It is the existence of recorded words, preserved in a form that can be reviewed repeatedly and compared against timelines. At the same time, investigators documented alleged deletion of messages. Charging documents referenced obstruction conduct, including deletion of WhatsApp messages. In a homicide investigation, such deletion is not treated as proof of guilt on its own. It is treated as a behavior that can indicate consciousness of exposure, especially when it occurs around key dates. It also provides investigators with a practical goal to recover what can be recovered and to determine what was removed and when. Digital evidence alone can establish timelines, but the case moved further when investigators identified physical findings linked to the home and to vehicles associated with Jennifer Gledhill. According to reporting on court records, prosecutors referenced forensic files and items linked to a minivan, along with evidence tied to cleanup efforts. The point of such evidence is not spectacle, it is reconstruction, showing that certain actions likely occurred and that they occurred in an order that conflicts with the outward narrative. A key element in the case, as described in court documents and reporting, involved indications of a cleanup. When a scene is cleaned after a violent event, it does not return to a neutral state. It leaves behind patterns. Abnormal chemical residues, disturbed surfaces, incomplete removal, and inconsistencies between what is visible and what is detected through forensic methods. The investigative relevance of cleanup evidence is straightforward. If the scene required cleaning, investigators ask why. This is where forensic reconstruction becomes more than a phrase. It is a method. Investigators compare physical findings inside the residence with digital timelines and with statements given to police. They ask whether a home environment is consistent with the reported scenario. They examine whether a person could have left voluntarily without leaving expected traces. They evaluate whether the timing of messages aligns with the location of devices. They look for points where the narrative depends on assumption rather than evidence. The case's reconstruction also involved movement data. In modern investigations, location information comes from multiple sources: cellular tower data, GPS logs, app activity, vehicle systems, and sometimes third-party service records. Even when location data is not precise to a single spot, it can establish whether a device was moving, stationary, or present in certain areas within a limited window. Court and media reporting in this case reference geolocation evidence tracking movements relevant to the investigation. As investigators assembled these records, contradictions became demonstrable rather than arguable. This is an important distinction. Early in many cases, investigators encounter contradictions that can be explained away as stress, imperfect memory, or confusion. But when a contradiction conflicts with a time-stamped message, a location record, or a documented event, it stops being a matter of interpretation. It becomes a matter of incompatibility. The investigation also documented alleged concealment and transport steps. According to court filings and multiple reports, prosecutors allege the body was placed into a rooftop storage container and transported, with additional steps taken afterward to conceal the remains. Whether the body has been recovered is a separate issue. Investigators do not need a recovered body to build a case if other evidence establishes the death and links it to the accused beyond reasonable doubt. In this case, official filings included a charge related to abuse or desecration of a human body, which reflects the prosecution's position that concealment occurred. Another strand of evidence involved the accused's parents. Reporting in court documents indicated that authorities believed family members assisted with cleanup or concealment actions, resulting in obstruction-related charges. This mattered for two reasons. First, it suggested the alleged post-crime actions were not isolated or momentary. Second, it created additional timelines and potential corroboration points: vehicle movements, visits to the home, and the duration of time spent at specific locations. Investigators also focused on the gap between the alleged date of the homicide and the date the missing person report was filed. In this case, reporting described a delay of several days. The investigative importance of such a delay is not that delay is inherently suspicious. People do not always report immediately. The importance lies in what can happen during that time. Messages can be sent, items can be moved, scenes can be cleaned, and narratives can be constructed in a way that becomes harder to dismantle later. As the evidentiary picture developed, the case began to pivot around an evidentiary pattern rather than a single smoking gun. The pattern, as described in reporting and filings, included communications that suggested prior knowledge, deletion of messages, indications of cleanup, movement data supporting transport, and an informant or witness providing recorded material. Each piece had a different evidentiary role. Some established timeline, some established behavior, some provided corroboration. Together, they formed a structure that did not depend on personal credibility. This is what it means when contradictions become provable. Investigators were no longer debating which version sounded plausible. They were showing that certain versions could not be true at the same time. If a device location places someone in one area at a given time, it cannot place them in another. If messages are sent after investigators believe a death has already occurred, the authorship and intent of those messages becomes a defined investigative question. If cleanup is evidenced, the claim that nothing unusual occurred becomes more difficult to sustain. Prosecutors later reflected this evidentiary foundation in formal charges. The filing included murder, along with multiple obstruction-related counts that reference specific conduct, such as deleting WhatsApp messages, cleaning the house, and using a moving truck, among other allegations. Those counts are not narrative language. They represent the prosecution's claim that evidence exists supporting those actions as part of a cover-up. By the time the investigation reached this stage, the case had changed in character. What began as a disappearance that could be framed as voluntary absence or an unknown event was now being reconstructed as a homicide, followed by deliberate concealment. That shift did not occur because investigators decided it felt that way. It occurred because evidence, digital, physical, and recorded, began closing off alternative explanations. This chapter marks the point at which the investigation no longer depended on what Jennifer Gledhill said. It depended on what investigators could demonstrate. Digital records established boundaries. Forensic findings suggested actions taken after the fact. Recorded communications and message histories became testable against those timelines. The contradictions were no longer interpretive, they were structural. In the next phase, investigators would use this evidence not only to confront inconsistencies, but to establish a single prosecutable narrative, one that could withstand scrutiny in court. By the time investigators confronted Jennifer Gledhill with the accumulated evidence, the case had moved beyond discrepancies and competing narratives. The focus was no longer on clarifying details, but on addressing contradictions that could be demonstrated through records, forensic findings, and documented timelines. The confrontation did not occur in a single moment. It was the result of a gradual tightening of the evidentiary framework. Investigators approached the process methodically, presenting verified information in stages rather than accusations. Each step was designed to test whether explanations could still align with what had been established. During formal interviews, investigators referenced specific data points. These included digital records, timestamps, and physical findings that conflicted with earlier statements. The approach was structured. Questions were not framed hypothetically. They were grounded in verifiable facts. When investigators presented phone records and message timelines, the explanations that had previously been offered became increasingly difficult to maintain. Statements about communication after the disappearance could no longer be reconciled with evidence indicating that the deceased was no longer alive at the time those messages were sent. Jennifer Gledhill was asked to account for these discrepancies. Her responses shifted from generalized explanations to narrower clarifications. Where earlier statements had described events broadly, later responses addressed individual points. This narrowing of focus reflected the reduced flexibility of the narrative. Investigators also addressed physical evidence associated with the residence and vehicles. They referenced findings that suggested actions had taken place inside the home that were inconsistent with the claim that nothing unusual had occurred. These questions were not speculative. They were based on documented observations. At this stage, investigators did not characterize the evidence as proof of guilt. Their role was to present findings and allow the interviewee to respond. The distinction between investigative confrontation and legal conclusion was maintained throughout the process. As the interviews continued, explanations became increasingly constrained. Some earlier statements were no longer repeated. Others were modified in ways that acknowledged parts of the evidence without fully accounting for it. Investigators documented each response carefully. The confrontation also involved addressing actions taken after the death. Investigators asked about delays in reporting, the handling of the residents, and the involvement of others. These questions were tied directly to evidence indicating that the scene had been altered and that communication patterns had been managed deliberately. In response, statements began to reflect partial acknowledgement rather than complete denial. Certain actions were no longer disputed. Instead, their significance was minimized or reframed. Investigators noted these shifts without interpreting intent. Documented admissions did not occur as a single comprehensive confession. Instead, they emerged incrementally. Statements confirmed specific actions while remaining silent or ambiguous about others. This pattern is common in cases where evidence restricts denial but does not compel full disclosure. Investigators distinguished between admissions of conduct and admissions of intent, acknowledging that an action occurred is not the same as admitting to its purpose or legal meaning. This distinction was preserved in both interviews and subsequent documentation. Throughout the process, investigators maintained a clear separation between factual statements and legal interpretation. When a statement aligned with evidence, it was recorded as confirmation. When it conflicted, the discrepancy was noted. Investigators did not assign motive or psychological explanation. As the confrontation progressed, the cumulative effect of the evidence became apparent. Individual explanations could no longer account for the full scope of documented facts. The narrative that had been presented earlier had fragmented under scrutiny. At this point, investigators shifted their focus toward formal charges. The purpose of further questioning was no longer to resolve uncertainty, but to establish a record that could be evaluated within a legal framework. Jennifer Gledhill's documented statements during this phase became part of that record. Each interview, response, and clarification was preserved. These materials were not treated as conclusions, but as data to be assessed by prosecutors. The distinction between investigative findings and legal judgment is critical at this stage. Investigators establish what can be shown. Prosecutors determine how that evidence meets statutory requirements. Courts evaluate whether the standard of proof has been met. In this case, the confrontation phase resulted in a record that prosecutors later relied upon. The statements did not exist in isolation. They were evaluated alongside digital evidence, forensic findings, and corroborating testimony. Importantly, the case did not depend on a comprehensive confession. Many criminal cases proceed without one. The evidentiary threshold is not admission, but proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Admissions, when they occur, are contextualized rather than determinative. Investigators documented where explanations changed, where acknowledgments occurred, and where silence replaced earlier certainty. These shifts were recorded without inference. The role of law enforcement is not to interpret motive, but to document behavior and statements. As formal charges were prepared, the investigative phase concluded. The confrontation had served its purpose: to test the narrative against evidence and to document responses when contradictions could no longer be avoided. What remained was the legal process. The admissions and statements collected during this phase would be examined in court, not as truth in themselves, but as elements within a broader evidentiary structure. Their weight would be determined in relation to other evidence. This chapter marks the transition from investigation to prosecution. The case no longer relied on explanations. It relied on records. The following chapter examines how that record was presented in court, how the legal system evaluated it, and what consequences followed. When the case moved from investigation to prosecution, the focus shifted from reconstruction to legal evaluation. The question was no longer what might have happened, but whether the evidence collected could meet the standard required in court. Prosecutors prepared to present a case built on documentation, forensic findings, and recorded statements, rather than on a single decisive moment or eyewitness account. Formal charges were filed against Jennifer Gledhill, reflecting the prosecution's position that a homicide had occurred and that subsequent actions were taken to conceal it. The charges included murder, along with counts related to obstruction and abuse of a human body. Each charge corresponded to specific conduct alleged by the state and supported by evidence gathered during the investigation. The pretrial phase involved the review of discovery materials, motions, and procedural hearings. Defense counsel examined the evidence for weaknesses, challenged admissibility where possible, and evaluated whether alternative interpretations could be argued. Prosecutors, in turn, refined their presentation to ensure that timelines, digital records, and forensic conclusions could be clearly explained to a jury. At trial, it was presented as a sequence rather than a singular event. Prosecutors outlined the relationship context, the night of the crime, the subsequent concealment, and the evolving explanations given to investigators. The structure of the case emphasized continuity. The death, the delay in reporting, and the actions taken afterward were framed as interconnected rather than isolated. Digital evidence formed a central pillar of the prosecution's argument. Phone records, message timestamps, and location data were introduced to establish when the death occurred and to demonstrate that communications continued after that point. These records were presented alongside expert testimony explaining how such data is generated and why it is considered reliable. Forensic findings were introduced to address the physical aspects of the case. Prosecutors described evidence of cleanup and movement, explaining how such actions leave detectable traces even when attempts are made to remove them. The emphasis remained on what could be demonstrated rather than on speculation about intent. Recorded statements and interviews were also presented. Jurors heard how explanations changed over time and how those changes corresponded with the emergence of new evidence. Rather than focusing on demeanor or emotion, the prosecution highlighted inconsistencies between statements and verified facts. The defense challenged the prosecution's narrative by questioning the interpretation of evidence. Attorneys argued that digital records could be misread, that timelines were not precise to the minute, and that alternative explanations for certain actions existed. They emphasized the absence of eyewitnesses and the lack of a recovered body as reasons for reasonable doubt. Throughout the proceedings, the court maintained a clear distinction between factual testimony and legal argument. Witnesses were called to establish what they observed or documented. Experts explained methods and limitations. Legal conclusions were reserved for closing arguments and jury instructions. The jury was tasked with evaluating whether the totality of evidence met the burden of proof. This did not require certainty about every detail, but it did require confidence that the prosecution's account was supported beyond reasonable doubt by the evidence presented. After deliberation, a verdict was reached. The jury found Jennifer Gledhill guilty on the charges presented. The verdict reflected acceptance of the prosecution's core argument, that a homicide had occurred and that actions were taken afterward to conceal it. Sentencing followed established legal guidelines. The court considered the nature of the offense, the evidence presented at trial, and statutory requirements. The sentence imposed reflected the seriousness of the charges and the findings of the jury. The legal outcome concluded the criminal proceedings, but it did not answer every question surrounding the case. As in many homicide cases, certain details remained unresolved or known only through inference. The court's role, however, was not to achieve narrative completeness, but to determine legal responsibility. From an investigative standpoint, the case illustrates how a homicide can remain concealed when early assumptions delay scrutiny. The initial framing of the situation as a disappearance rather than a crime allowed time for actions that complicated later reconstruction. It was evidence rather than intuition that ultimately reframed the case. From a legal perspective, the case demonstrates the role of cumulative proof. No single element alone established guilt. Instead, digital records, forensic findings, and documented statements collectively formed a structure that could be tested in court. The consequences of the case extend beyond the sentence imposed. They include the legal precedent of prosecuting a homicide without immediate reporting, the use of digital evidence to establish timelines, and the evaluation of post-crime conduct as part of a broader narrative. This case does not rely on speculation about motive or character. Its resolution rests on actions that could be documented and verified. The legal system addressed those actions within its defined framework, resulting in a verdict based on evidence rather than inference. In closing, the Jennifer Gledhill case underscores the importance of verification over explanation. What initially appeared to be an absence became, through investigation and trial, a documented homicide. The process by which that transformation occurred reflects both the strengths and limitations of modern forensic and legal systems. The case ends not with certainty about every moment, but with accountability established through law. That outcome represents the final consequence of a sequence of actions that began quietly and concluded in court.